So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining for another session of Azure Power Lunch. Um, and quick disclaimer that this call is being recorded and we place our recordings on our YouTube channel. So if you are not comfortable with it, you may want to drop off now. And this call is joined by our Microsoft team members as well as our members from our customers and partners. So with that, let's move on with our topic of discussion, which is Azure AD workload identity support for AKS. So as usual, that we always do, we're going to quick uh, level set on some of the topics like workload identity, and then we will jump into what this support is all about, and we will see a demo, and of course, please feel free to ask any questions. So first of all, identity is just a quick refresher. If you want to know more about it, please. We did a session a few months back on workload identities, or just search workload identities on Azure, and there's a lot of information there. But quick recap, identities can be of different type. You have human identities like a social security number, employee ID, things like that. And then you have machine identities. For example, device identity. It's the identifier of a PC or a mobile device identifier, things like that. And then you have the workload identity, which is identity related to a software program or software workload. With that, you can access other resources. Okay, and uh, when it comes to Azure, Azure AD is our identity platform. So, what are the workload identities? Uh, what we can use to identify workloads in Azure AD is are basically service principal. You have application and you have managed identities, which can be user assigned or system assigned managed identities. So with that and how they're used, basically workload identities are used to access resources on the behalf of the workload. If you are familiar with managed identity, basically you are kind of using workload identities behind, same concept, you know. Um, but workload identities is a more generic concept to deal with certain these such identities, and um, it's the thing is it's being adopted by other organizations as well. So that's why I think of it as a more of a kind of a cross platform concept. As you can see that Microsoft is also adding workload identity support, and more broadly for compatibility reason and all. So with that, I mean, this is about workload identity federation. So why we need, first of all, what problem it's solving? The problem that it's solving is when you are trying to access resources from AKS. So let's say you have AKS, you have nodes and pods running on it, your app is running inside the pod, and you need to access resources like from storage, key vault, database. You don't want to use credentials stored somewhere to access those resources. What you want to do is you want to take the identity of the pod itself and access those resources. And identity solved that issue in the past, where you assign an identity to pod, um, and it can use it to go to key vault. The advantage is that you have now a kind of a you don't have to store connection string and all that information all over the place. And it's a very clean method to access those resources. You can have a clear separation of who are giving, like a security team and developers. Security team can give access. Okay, these are identities, and they will be able to access these resources. And developers can continue to work without worrying about storing connection strings and secrets in their code. you know um, but it has certain drawbacks. And workload identity integration with AKS is trying to address that. So let's talk about what are some of those drawbacks that pod managed identity has. And if you go back, search in our YouTube channel, you will see a session on pod identity. And um, it was in preview for a very, very long time. First of all, it wasn't a native Kubernetes mechanism to begin with. You know, Microsoft did the custom resource descriptor and interception. Definition and custom resource definition and interceptors to basically implement that. You know, this that's how it was done. And if you have looked at it, it's there are a lot to go to implement that. And if you miss one of those steps with all those complexities, you are stuck in a state where you may have to start over. So it's not as simple, kind of a simple way to implement. And then the last thing was it was only supported for Linux. For Windows workload, there was no support for pod managed identity. And all of these things are addressed by this workload identity for AKS. So it is addressing that particular problem. Okay, any questions? Okay, so once again, just want to clarify this is addressing the age old problem of how my application that is running in AKS inside a pod, how it can access other Azure resources. You know, how I do it without by using its own identity. So this is, as I said, it was resolved by pod managed identity, but it has some limitations. So now they have this workload identity for AKS that is kind of taking it to the next step and resolving all those issues. So how it works? First of all, it uses Kubernetes service identifier as one of the key part of this entire chain. Okay, so what you do is you have a configuration file or YAML file where you link a Kubernetes service identifier with a managed identity. So that's how you create this link. Okay, and once that link has been created, now workload can ask Azure Active Directory, hey, this is the service identity that I'm Azure service account that I'm sorry, AKS service account that I'm running under, and it can use based on this linking, it can go and issue a token, you know, um, for the access token because you have this service account linkage with that Azure AD managed identity. Okay, and we will look at the and each step. Just bear with me for a second, and then you can use that identity to access other resources. So that's how this thing is working. So there are actually three things here. First of all, and let's take a look at these steps. I think the next slide. Yes. First of all, you have the managed identity. You create a user managed identity. Okay. Then you create a service account and you can link that user managed identity with that service account. That's one of the key piece. And by the way, this linkage doesn't have to be one to one. You can have one service account and many managed identity that it is linked to. You can have one managed identity which is linked to many service accounts. So it can be many, many, one to one. Okay. And the last piece of the puzzle, as you can see, the last statement here, establish federal identity, federated, federal, can't speak today, federated identity credential. So that's where you are creating a federated identity credential, which kind of links everything together. Basically, the whole workload identity paradigm is complete. And at that moment, what you do is when you deploy a pod or a service, you just annotate it with that particular service account, and it will and then it can take advantage of it can take advantage of the workload identity to access other resources. Okay. Any questions? I know it's a lot of information.
Hi, Navid. The
Yes.
quick question on. So, does it have to be a user assigned managed identity?
Yes, right now. So as I said, one thing has to be a Kubernetes service account. Yes. The second part, yes, you have to have a user assigned managed identity, because think of it, it cannot be system assigned because system assigned is tied to a resource. Okay. So that's why
Yeah,
you
no.
have to, yeah.
Yeah, no. The reason I brought up that question is that we are little reluctant to use the user assigned because let's say that user assigned have access to a key vault,
Hmm.
and someone has a VM contributor on one of the machine, right? It is not stopping that resource, that person, to go and attach that user assigned managed identity to that VM because they have a limited permission. Now, because of that, they can go to that VM and then start querying the key vault, right? Um, so system assigned, there is no way to fool around with it. But I understand in this case, system assigned won't apply.
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure about that's a good one. I don't know about the limitation. Like, is there a way to stop somebody to kind of a link to a privileged user assigned identity? I have to look into it, man. Sorry, but that's a
Right.
good point. If that is the case, then yes, then that would be a problem.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
that's a risk. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, but I have to look into it. I can't say for sure if there is a way to block that type of access assignment. Okay. So yeah. So basically, with that, let's jump into any other questions before we jump into a little bit of a demo. Okay, so first of all, it's a preview feature. Just keep that in mind. And with all preview features, you have to run these commands, the first two, extension, and before you do anything, okay, you have to run AKS preview and update the AKS preview. If you already updated, then there's no need. The next piece is, for example, I didn't see the documentation, but it's here. So you have to register enable workload identity preview on your this namespace. Okay, you run this thing one time and it takes 5, 10, 15 minutes to register. You will see it registering, and then once it's registered, then you go about um, you know uh, your work. And just keep that in mind that this is the step that you need to kind of execute. So, for example, you are starting with a fresh subscription. Maybe this just want to make sure you go through these steps before you move on to the next steps. Okay. So here is I'm gonna share my VS Code. And here are some of the steps here. So, this is the feature registration, all that. And then on line 17, or actually line 18 is the main line, that's where I am creating a user managed identity. And I am basically the good, I'm assigning it to a variable. Okay. Remember, that was the first part. You create a user assigned identity. Okay. Then you create a federation setup. In that, you are doing a service account first, and this is the AKS service account that you're creating. And you are attaching it to that user assigned managed identity. Okay, that's where you assign the service account name, namespace, all that stuff. And by the way, it assumes that you have created those environment variables and things like that. Otherwise, you can hard code these value. And by the way, I'm just this code is there. Everything in the tutorial is very well documented. That is available uh, on Azure Docs. I have a link to that tutorial as well, except that this line is not there to register the feature, because if you try to run it without it, you will get an error. Okay, so yeah, okay. Uh, so let's move on and let's continue going down here. Uh, hmm. Very interesting. That any question on this? That this is okay. So everybody understand this is how you're linking the ID to the. I mean the basically um, managed identity to the service account. Once that is done, then you are creating the federation identity federation, and that's where you're creating a new identity federation. You are using uh, and you're using a service account with it. Okay, so that kind of ties everything together. Okay, you have the um, managed identity here, you have the service account information here. Everything is all tied up with this federated identity. Okay, and once that has been created, then we are deploying this pod, and we are using this pod to use um, basically the service account name and trying to push that out. Uh, and it's going to be using that service account name uh, to access the Key Vault resource. Okay. Everybody good so far? So let me show you this. If we try to run this command, okay, so I think my login has expired. So let me So just for the sake of time, I've already created an AKS cluster and everything. We will just run the pod on it and see if we get the desired result. Okay, so let this thing run. Yes. And let's go back here to our console one more time. In the meantime, any questions? Sure. Okay, interesting. Okay, in any case, so this is basically that's how you register that account. And now let's run the pod. So let's going back to the VS Code. We have this pod that we are gonna be running, and it's using a uh, kind of a container, which the only thing it does is it um, goes to a key vault using the workload identity and try to access a secret. So let's take a look at what I have created so far. Give me 1 second. Let me go in here. We have an AKS cluster where I have applied the managed identity. We have a key vault. And as you can see here, I have created a secret, my secret here. And if you look at the access policy, this is the managed identity that I have created, user managed identity. And that managed identity has access uh, to uh, to read that secret. That's all there is to it. And just to show you one more time, um, the resources, we have cluster, we have key vault, and this is the user managed identity. Okay. And we have done all the setup where we have assigned the service account, attach it to the managed identity, created the federated identity. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to um, run the command to run the container, and let's see if it can access um, the um, this secret from the key vault. And I have so let's go back in here, and let's copy that thing here. Just gonna run this. Okay, so let's run it. Okay, so this container has started, and if everything goes well, we should see um, in the logs the secret that it has achieved retrieved from the key vault. As you can see, this is the log. So this is the quick start container that we have started. This is the name of the container, and look at that. It has retrieved the. So now what it is doing is, as I mentioned before, using the workload identity, it went in and used that to access the secret from key vault. Okay, so that's what it's doing. One thing to keep in mind when you run this command, and let me go in here, and the command I'm referring to this one, the federated identity, where you create the federated credential, you may have to give a pause for a few minutes, a few seconds for this identity to take into effect because it takes few seconds before you run the actual container command. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's in the documentation as well. Okay. So that's pretty much it. Any questions?
Now, with one question again. So for the service account we are creating, that is a scope to a particular namespace, right? So
That is right.
because
Yes, exactly.
we might have multiple namespaces,
Oh,
so it
absolutely.
is
Yep,
part of that namespace, and because of that, we can restrict that account to be used only by that the pods running in that namespace. Yeah.
absolutely. Yep.
Thank you.
And anyways, when you are running the when you're running the pods and things like that, I mean, you can have may have multiple identity. For example, let's say that there is a application that is running that need to access some sensitive data. Okay, and then there is an application which is just accessing some general information, but they both need workload identity. You may want to create multiple workload identities, as you say. Okay, one for the sensitive data that is only used by those pods, and one for the more general stuff. You know, that's kind of that's the advantage, and you can kind of very clearly separate out, um, and try to minimize the risk. Okay. If folks, any other questions? Okay. If there are no other questions, I will give everybody their 3 minutes back and hope to see everybody next week for another session of Azure Power Lunch and have a um, wonderful weekend.